Joining us now over Zoom is Professor Bilal Sekou, Professor of Political Science at the University of Hartford in the Hillyer College. Bilal, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. I just wanted to start real quick by examining some of the local races. We touched on this earlier, but I just want to come back to it for a second. The 5th District is an incredibly close race between George Logan and Jahana Hayes. And I want to talk a lot about the messaging that we've seen, because Logan has kind of poised himself in a different way, distancing himself from the Republican Party socially, but saying that he's fiscally conservative. And I think we saw in the debate that Jahana Hayes kind of pulled that assumption apart a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about what we've seen as far as messaging in that race?
Right. I think in watching that debate that took place, it was very clear that the message that Logan wanted to get across is a message that the Republican Party is hammering nationally, that the problems of crime, the problems of the economy, specifically inflation, are things that have been caused by the Democrats. And so what he has been pushing hard in his messaging is to say, look, we need to put Republicans in Congress in order to be a check on the Biden administration. He talked a lot about the spending, but from his perspective has been excessive spending. And so the way in which he has tried to frame his message is that inflation is a problem. People who live in the 5th District are suffering because of high inflation. And when you go to the grocery store, you're paying a lot more for things like eggs and milk. And when you go to the gas station, you're paying a lot more than you were a year ago for gasoline. And also the message around crime, that crime is up and that the Democrats really don't have an answer to that. So the message is fairly straightforward as far as what Logan is trying to hit home, in the district with people.
Yeah, and we've been, like you said, we've been hearing nationally from Republicans about these issues of inflation and crime. And while Connecticut actually has a gas price lower than the national average, I think this morning it was at about $3.77 nationally. It's at $3.80. It's just a little bit beneath. We have been seeing this messaging about crime, and a lot of that has to do with the way, especially local news, plays a part in developing storylines about crime rates. Do you think Connecticut is at a place where crime is a major concern?
Well, the reality is that while violent crime is up, specifically homicides are up, overall crime is down. It's nowhere near where it was in the past here in Connecticut in terms of the crime rate, especially violent crime. But we saw during the pandemic, the crime rates actually were a bit lower, and then they ticked up as this pandemic sort of loosened and people were out in the streets more and, attending clubs and interacting with each other more. And so we saw an uptick in some areas when it came to crime. But overall, Connecticut is a relatively safe state for most people. But yet this message is something that Republicans have been trying to hammer home, especially to people who live out in the suburbs. And that message resonates with those folks because as you say in your question, really, is that people, when you watch the local news, you see reports about homicides, you see reports about crime nationally, and that triggers a reaction on the part of voters who perceive that crime is out of control, that it is increasing dramatically. But the reality is it hasn't. The state of Connecticut has reported those crime statistics, and actually we are a relatively safe state compared to a lot of other places in the country.
One of the real stickling points, I think, in almost every election at this point is the suburban voters, because they're likely the closest thing remaining to what is a swing voter nowadays. So I want to turn to the election in Georgia, because that's been, I think, one of the closest toss-up races in the country at this point. Where do you think that the suburban voters are likely to swing tonight?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I think, one of the things that's intriguing to me about this election cycle is that a lot of people are turning out to vote. A lot of people who normally wouldn't vote during the midterm election. Now, whether polls have captured this group of people who are perhaps deciding at the very last moment that they want to vote can really make the difference. If it turns out that you see an uptick in people who will show up on election day who are Democrats, then Warnock may be able to pull away in that race in Georgia. But right now, it's neck and neck. It's a lot closer than many people had predicted, especially given all of the problems that Herschel Walker has had with issues of infidelity, the debate around abortion, and whether he paid for abortions from ex-girlfriends. And so all of those things are in the mix. But it seems like at this point, we won't know anything until the last vote is cast and the last vote is actually counted. And then we'll know for sure what the outcome of that race is. And I think it's very similar to what will happen in the 5th district. We really won't know until all the votes are counted just who won. Jahana Hayes sits in probably the most vulnerable seat in Connecticut and probably one of the most vulnerable seats in the Northeast itself when it comes to the Democrats holding that seat. There aren't many Republicans here in the Northeast who have been elected to Congress, and so this would be a nice feather in their hat if Logan is able to pull that off. And in Georgia, control of the Senate is at play. And if Republicans are able to win back that seat in Georgia, hold on to the seats that they have on the ballot right now, then they have the majority and they have control of Congress. Well, control of Congress and control of the Senate and possibly control of the House as well.
You brought up Walker's issues of infidelity and the controversy surrounding Walker's campaign. In messaging, it seems as though while Walker has been following the national lead for Republicans of launching a more attack-oriented campaign against Warnock, Warnock has been really focusing on the successes that he's had, especially since entering office in the runoff election from early last year. Do you think that this difference in messaging is going to play to one side or not?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is Warnock is a minister. He is a minister in the church that Dr. Martin Luther King once was the minister of. He's someone who is very reluctant to get in the mud and sling mud and to bring up this issue around abortion and infidelity. And so from his standpoint, what he wants to do is to talk about his record, to talk about the legislative achievements of the Biden administration and the role he has played in helping to bring about those achievements. They really do think, money going for infrastructure, money going to help and assist families that, were unable to work during the height of this pandemic were real achievements of the Biden administration and real achievements of the Democratic Party. And so from his perspective, and again, as a man of faith, and the leader of a major and significant congregation down in Georgia, he just doesn't want to get in the mud and sling that kind of mud and attack his opponent in ways that some people on the outside are much more willing to do. So Georgia, like Connecticut, has seen a lot of money from the outside come into the state. And so a lot of those negative ads we see here in Connecticut are actually funded by outside groups. And I'm fairly certain, even though we don't live in Georgia, that there are a lot of negative ads that are running as well on the air in Georgia, trying to remind voters of these lapses in judgment and also morality, as some might say, with regard to Herschel Walker, and that may play with some voters. It may actually win him over the top, Warnock, in that sense.
Yeah, and I think Warnock being such a prominent figure in Georgia, not just as a political leader, but as a community leader as well, is going to play massively in his favor.
And a religious leader. And so I think that's an important part of what his identity is to Georgia voters. And so a lot of it really will depend on what that get out the vote, effort that both the Democrats and Republicans, I'm sure, are engaged in Georgia, whether they're able to turn out their voters. I mean, this will be interesting because the early voting that has gone on in Georgia has been record-breaking early voting. That tends to go in the favor of Democrats in terms of the early voting. but on election day, it tends to go in the favor of Republicans. And so what you're likely to see early on is, this sense until all the votes are counted that there will be a lead for Herschel Walker in this race. But then once those votes, those early votes are counted and absentee ballots are counted, then that race will tighten up and Warnock may be able to, get a victory. But again, a lot depends on what that turnout will look like today.
I want to turn now to Ohio because that's also been an incredibly interesting race ideologically. You have J.D. Vance, who, although he describes himself as a conservative outsider, really falls along what we would expect as traditional Republican Party lines. He's endorsed by Tucker Carlson. He's endorsed by former President Donald Trump, who was stumping for him recently. But then he's running against a Democrat, Tim Ryan, who has purposefully distanced himself from the Biden administration. He, points to his support of former President Trump's policies during his time in office. Do you think that being so ideologically close and having the Democratic, so-and-so candidate being more center-right is going to make that election closer, even though it's projected to be a Republican win?
Right. I mean, Ohio is a very red state, so it's actually surprising that this race is as close as it actually is. And, I think, what was key to, that endorsement from Donald Trump was really key to helping him win the nomination on the Republican Party side. But at the same time, he also comes with a lot of baggage. At one point, he was highly critical of Donald Trump when Donald Trump initially took office, and then he switched and became someone who was much more supportive of Donald Trump. And certainly Republicans, I think, may have some questions about whether he's a true conservative in the sort of Donald Trump fashion. But I think this is one of those situations where Vance has a real opportunity to win this seat, to hold on to this seat for Republicans. And I think this will be, key also to Republicans gaining control of the Senate. They need to hold on to that seat in Ohio. On the other hand, Ryan has a great opportunity to win that seat. And I think this is another race that will, go long into the night in terms of actually counting early votes and absentee ballots before we actually know who the winner is.
Yeah, and a reminder that we will keep you updated as we find out more results here tonight on SDN2. Vance, I heard a very interesting description of him as a grifter recently. That's not something I've really heard thrown around in politics all that much, but he's not alone in that. In the Pennsylvania race just next door, Mehmet Oz has been described as a grifter, and that is an entirely that race is a beast unto itself, because it seems as though this is the most nationally known race, despite theoretically only affecting the residents of Pennsylvania, though there's the control of the Senate at stake, and just really seeing whether it appears as though that this race is a bellwether for whether the Biden administration and the candidates that it supports are playing well, and how well the administration is doing approval-wise, where the administration itself is stuck around an approval rating of 40%. In this race, the Fetterman-Oz race, do you agree that it's a national bellwether, or do you think that it's entirely separate from that?
And again, when you look at that race, what's key, again, to Republicans being able to gain control of the Senate, they need to hold on to that seat, right? And so we have this really interesting situation. Mehmet Oz, of course, is someone who was a popular television host at one point. He's someone who a lot of people knows. He has great name recognition from being on television. He got an endorsement from the former president, Donald Trump. Oddly enough, in this race, his challenger, Fetterman, had a stroke, what seems to be a fairly major stroke. And so he's been recovering while he's on the campaign trail. Oz, of course, is someone who is identified as not really being a Pennsylvanian. He's coming from out of state and has come into Pennsylvania to run for this seat. So there's a lot of stories, around this election that I think, again, makes it hard to predict what the outcome will be. Fetterman had a fairly substantial lead several months ago, and that lead has disappeared. And now this race, again, is a toss-up, and it's not really clear who will actually win it on election night until all the votes are counted.
And it follows this trend of what is typically an establishment politician, Fetterman being the active lieutenant governor of the state, running against a relative outsider. Mehmet Oz being a TV personality, J.D. Vance being an author and lawyer, as opposed to Ryan, who has served in the House of Representatives for Ohio since 2003. And Georgia, where Warnock has served in this position for 2 years, and Walker is most famously a player for the Georgia Bulldogs. Is there a reason that the Republican Party seems to be throwing their support behind these outsider candidates?
Well, I think in this case, the Republican Party has their support behind these outside candidates, primarily because the former president endorsed all three of them. And so in many ways, Mitch McConnell, who is the former leader of the Senate for Republicans, he commented some months ago that he thought, this would be a real challenge this election season because they had candidates on the ballot who were running for Republican Senate and also House seats who were flawed. And so McConnell wasn't happy, and I'm sure many people in the establishment of the Republican Party weren't happy about Mehmet Oz, weren't happy about seeing Herschel Walker on the ticket, but that Trump endorsement really galvanized the base during the primaries, and they elevated these candidates to be the ones who would represent the party in November. So I'm not sure if Republicans really like the Republican Party establishment actually likes these candidates, but that base that really likes Donald Trump, they responded to Trump's endorsement and they went out and supported people. We saw that here in Connecticut with Leora Levy, in which she received a last-minute Trump endorsement, and she was able to beat Themis Claridis for the nomination for Senate to challenge Richard Blumenthal. And, Themis Claridis had been a leader in the House of Representatives, had been a long-time legislator here in the state of Connecticut, well-known across the state, and yet she lost in the primary. And I think that Trump endorsement in all three of those situations that you mentioned was really key to what happened.
And, with Trump theoretically making the announcement for his candidacy in 2024 with an event at Mar-a-Lago on the 15th, it really looks like we're gearing up for a repeat of the 2020 election. Do you think that this is going to become the norm for the Republican Party, where establishment candidates are just going to have to bite their tongues as the party moves more towards Trump-endorsed candidates? Or do you think that it's going to swing back to traditional, what the party has been beforehand?
Yeah. I mean, it's not altogether clear that this will be just a moment that we are experiencing or whether this is really a reflection of where the Republican Party is headed. Once again, I mean, I think that there is a sizable portion of the base that loves Donald Trump, that loves the kind of politics that Donald Trump represents. And so, I think there may be a good reason to believe that this just is what the Republican Party is at the moment and what it will be going forward into the future. And that some of the more moderate, some of the sort of older, style Republicans may need to find a new home for themselves in some sort of a conservative party, because it seems like clearly the Republican Party of today is the Donald Trump party. Now, whether 2024 we see a replay of the 2020 election, I think is a question that's worth asking. I'm not altogether sure if I can answer it, primarily because Joe Biden will be 82 in 2024. Donald Trump will be 78. And it's not altogether clear that voters will want candidates who are that old on the ballot. And 2 years is a lot of time for someone else to rise up and get some wind behind their back. I mean, DeSantis in Florida is certainly someone who might challenge Donald Trump for that nomination. If he smells blood in the water and he thinks he can wrestle that away from Trump, I'm fairly certain he will run. And the Republicans have a long bench of people from, Cruz to Rubio to Lake in Arizona and Pence and others who may want to try to go for that nomination. I think the Democrats don't have as deep a bench of people who could, step up and make that run if Joe Biden decides not to run. But Joe Biden has clearly indicated he's willing to run again, and he has every intent to do that again. So we'll just have to wait and see.
And we'll just have to wait and see about the rest of the results tonight. Professor Bilal Sekou, a doctorate of political science here at the Hillyer College at the University of Hartford. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Dylan, for having me.